My name is Laura Mandel. I'm director of the Center of Digital Humanities Research at Texas A&M University and a professor in English. I wanted to introduce Laura formally and then with an anecdote. So after completing a PhD at Berkeley, Laura Nelson became an assistant professor of sociology at Northeastern University and core faculty at the NU Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks. This is a part of Northeastern is doing a huge digital humanities series of cluster hires, and it's emerging as the place to do digital humanities. She is a faculty affiliate at the Network Science Institute on the executive committee of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, and on the editorial board of Sociological Methodology and the feminist journal Signs. Dr. Nelson has held positions as a postdoctoral research fellow at Digital Humanities at Berkeley, the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, the Northwestern Institute on Complex Systems, just to mention a few. An open science enthusiast, Dr. Nelson uses open source tools and computational methods to make the social sciences and humanities more transparent, reproducible, and scalable. She uses automated text analysis principally to study social movements, culture, gender, institutions, and organizations. I'll just name a few of her recent publications. The Meaning of Action, linking goals, tactics, and strategies in the environmental movement. Another one is To Measure Meaning in Big Data. Don't give me a map, give me transparency and reproducibility. And another one, The Computation Context Trade-off. I'm an avid reader and fan. I first heard Dr. Nelson speak during the last year of a 6-year grant program called Text Mining the Novel that was run by Andrew Piper at McGill University in Canada. And during that 6 years, every time I had protested the way some of the text miners were analyzing gender, I was told that I just didn't like the results. And Laura came in and gave this brilliant talk. And I'm sure some of that, what she said there is going to come through today about the necessity of intersectionality for grasping a complete picture of reality. So Laura, welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that introduction and for having me here. I'm going to share my screen. So my here, sorry, let me just get this set up correctly. I will be looking at the chat box. So if people have questions or even just, backroom chatter comments as I'm talking, you can put them in the chat box for everyone to see. I will try to answer questions if there are questions in the chat box. Sometimes I miss them if I'm kind of going back and forth, but I'm very happy to have people kind of throw thoughts and ideas in the chat box as I'm speaking. So I'm going to start with a few proclamations that may or may not be controversial in this particular group. So one is interaction effects is not the same as intersectionality, and that was getting a little bit about what Laura was mentioning. The second one is that machine learning is inductive, and I will go much more into this. And the third is a future, perhaps the future of machine learning is intersectional. So that's something I hope to convince at least some of you of today as I talk. So I want to lay some groundwork first. I often give talks to and I teach to interdisciplinary groups, and I quickly find that we're using the same terms, often differently. So I like to define the terms first so we can all be on the same page as we're having a discussion here. So the first term is intersectionality, which has been around for a century or more. It was formally coined as intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s, but it was around certainly long before that. And it has become a very large and popular framework for understanding the social world across many social science disciplines as well as humanities disciplines. So I'm defining intersectionality as the theoretical framework for understanding how social identities and categories combine and interact with systems of social, cultural, economic, and political power to create distinct and unequal lived experiences. So kind of highlighted the important words there. So it's about social identities combining, but also interacting and embedded in these systems of power to create these lived experiences. So intersectionality as an epistemology suggests that identities and institutions are relational, that identity is an embedded experience. You don't experience your gender abstracted out of the social context you're embedded in. It's experienced in and through that context. That nested hierarchies are situationally specific. So if we're talking about individuals, in some cases your gender may be the most important identity, in other cases your race may be, and that depends on the situation. So you can't assume a priori what will be more important. And relatedly, context is key to knowing. So we can't understand gender, race, intersectionality in the abstract, but only in and through this social context. And categories are mutually constitutive, they're not additive. So gender and race is just not adding gender on top of race. The combined intersection changes both gender and race. So that's what that means to be mutually constitutive there. So a few other terms. When I say deductive analysis, I use it in the social science sense, which is you start with a theory, you analyze data, and you see if your hypotheses are supported or not. So theory, data, check your hypotheses. Inductive is the reverse. So again, I'm using it in the social science sense. So you gather data, you look for patterns in your data, and then you develop theory or pattern or conclusions out of those patterns. So they're kind of the reverse approach to research. And in the social sciences and in sociology, starting in the 1950s and 1960s, variable-based regression analysis became kind of the predominant way that people studied the social world. It's a very powerful framework. For people who have probably seen this, it's the general approach is to propose a relationship between variables, so the classic linear relationship, for example, and see if that relationship fits your data. You can add more variables, you can add as many variables as you want. You can add interaction effects, which I mentioned early, so you can say the relationship will be different for different variables in your equation, and you can propose not a linear relationship, but a quadratic relationship, etc. And you can do much more, and you can get more and more sophisticated and more complicated. But really, all of this comes down to inferential statistics, right? You assume a known relationship and you assess the fit. It's a very mathematical framework. You assume a mathematical relationship before analyzing the data. It's very rigid. You rely on statistical significance, the all-important p-value, the confidence intervals, that kind of drives the patterns that are important in our data. And what makes it really powerful is that it provides interpretable parameters. So not only do you know the mathematical relationship, you know the size of the beta coefficient, you know the size of it. So it's a very powerful way of looking at the social world. Of course, many people have critiqued this for being inadequate to understand the social world. So feminist and critical race theorists immediately criticized this method as it was becoming dominant in the 50s and 60s. And one of the critiques is intercategorical complexity. So these models often rely on the standard social categories, race, class, gender, and that often misses categories that don't fit into those standard categories. And often we don't even have enough data to be able to study categories that don't fit into the standard dominant social categories. So we're missing out on a bunch of the social identities that are important to the social world. Another challenge is intra-categorical complexity. So each one of us is made up of a complex intersection of multiple identities, and to split them up into discrete variables doesn't really capture the way that these work in the social world. A third is anti-categorical complexity. So this is the Emerald Elysium. It's part plant, part animal, it uses photosynthesis, it has a brain, it eats. So it doesn't fit into any of the categories that we think of. So we may not even be thinking of all the categories that are important in the social world when we have to assume the categories a priori. And a fourth critique is the processes critique. So this is the idea that kind of assuming independent causal effects and assuming these discrete variables is not capturing the interactions, the everyday interactions, everyday kind of activity that really makes up the social world and influences people. So when you're chopping it up into these variables, you're missing this really important part of the social world. So this overall critique is that there's no view from nowhere, which is kind of assumed in the inferential statistics framework. When you flatten out the social world to try to put it into that framework, you miss the real mechanisms. And this is not a social justice claim. This is not, why don't you study women more? This really is, if you want to study the social world, you need to study it in a different way. This doesn't capture the real social world, the real mechanisms happening. So a strong critique of the inferential statistics method. And machine learning kind of entered recently, and it's poised to perhaps supplant the kind of inferential statistics model in the social sciences. So machine learning is algorithms and statistical models that computer systems use to perform a specific task without using explicit instructions, so relying on patterns and inference instead. And if we think about our four kind of critiques here, we have more data than we ever did before. We can capture more categories, more types of categories. We have high dimensional data, so we can capture more features of an individual person than we previously could. Certainly we can use unsupervised methods to allow categories to emerge from the data without us assuming a priori we know the categories. And the type of data we have is actually really different and in some ways exciting, because it can capture interactions, processes, the things that are very difficult to capture with traditional survey methods, inferential statistic methods. So we have a new paradigm that's fundamentally different than inferential statistics. You assume unknown relationships and you allow them to emerge from the data. It's an empirical method. It's not based on a mathematical model. It's based on patterns that emerge from the data itself. It's very elastic. It's not based on statistical significance, but generalizability. Does your model work on multiple data sets or types of data? And it relies on prediction, which can be a bit of a black box. So it doesn't really output the interpretable parameters that we get with inferential statistics method. And this really scares a lot of social scientists. So they see, no confidence intervals, no p-values, what do we do? No beta coefficient. So it's not taking the social sciences by storm for many reasons. And part of that is it's very difficult to kind of figure out how to interpret machine learning models the same way we've been interpreting models for decades now. And that's causing some conflict within the social science world. And it looks like also maybe physical science as well, as I'm seeing in the comments. So fundamentally, inferential statistics is a deductive method. Now, of course, it can be used in an inductive way. It can be used deductively or inductively, but I'm meaning the mathematical assumptions behind inferential statistics are a deductive versus machine learning, which again, machine learning can be used in inductive or deductive ways, but the mathematical assumptions behind machine learning are inductive. And it's important for me to get across that this means supervised machine learning. So I often get, yeah, unsupervised is inductive, but what about supervised machine learning? Even with supervised machine learning, the way it approaches the data is inductive, right? You give it outcome variables and you have it predict those outcome variables, but it allows the patterns to predict it to emerge from the data. It's a fundamentally inductive method, regardless of whether you're using supervised or unsupervised machine learning methods. So the situation where we are right now, which is posing challenges, is that a lot of people in the social sciences or physicists and mathematicians coming to social data are trying to force computational methods as a quantitative method into a parametric or an inferential epistemology, whereas I think we would be more well served and we can do much, much more with these methods if we treat it as a quantitative method with a qualitative epistemology, which we're not doing very much in the social sciences. So by flipping the way we think about what we can get out of these methods, I think we can leverage them in a much more powerful way. So so the statement there is that the mathematical assumptions in machine learning are perfectly aligned with intersectionality as epistemology, which is in some ways a qualitative method. So I'm using this as kind of a case study to explore why I think we should be changing the way we approach machine learning as a paradigm, as a method. Ontology as well. So we can debate epistemology and ontology, but I'm going to talk about intersectionality as epistemology. So the empirical case I'm going to present now is the 19th century US South. So this is this picture is a bit of a misnomer because it's neither from the 19th century nor the US South. This is from 1916 in Chicago. but it illustrates a point. This is, of course, the headquarters for colored women voters in 1916. So the 19th century US South was profoundly disruptive in US society. We started, of course, with full slavery, the abolitionist movement, the Civil War, which ended slavery, which moved into Reconstruction, which was a very tumultuous period. Post-Reconstruction, with the rise of the KKK, Jim Crow laws, then we moved into the 20th century where we had the lynching, the rise of lynching, the rise of the KKK, the battle around the vote, and of course, World War I. So it's a very disruptive century, long century, and it was experienced very, very differently by different groups of people. So certainly Black women did not experience this century the same way white women did. Black women did not experience this century the same way Black men did. So it's a great example of kind of I mean, any period is intersectional, but this one is particularly stark in the United States. And the first articulation of intersectional theory was done by Black women during this era. So Anna Julia Cooper, Mary Church Terrell, they were some of the early people to really articulate this perspective. So it's a good empirical case study to explore how we can maybe use machine learning to understand intersectional experiences. And of course, a lot of historians have done this. We have a lot of books written about intersectionality within slavery, slavery, pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, Reconstruction. So I'm not doing anything new here. I'm just looking at it through a different lens and seeing how we can leverage kind of different types of data and different lenses to think about this century. So the data I use come from Documenting the American South, which is a digital collection housed at the University of North Carolina, which is a bunch of primary sources from this long century in the United States. I'm using two collections. One is a collection of ex-slave narratives that they have digitized, and the second one is first-person narratives from the American South, which is a diverse group of narratives that includes women, laborers, slaves and ex-slaves, enslaved people and ex-enslaved people, and such. So when I did some cleaning on it, it comes to 414 full book length work. So this is well over millions and millions of words here. And then there was books by white women, white men, Black women, and by Black men, or written about the Black community by white and Black men. So this is my data set. The specific approach I'm taking is using word embeddings. So I'll talk about this, but I think the broader methods conclusions go for many other machine learning methods, not just word embeddings. So the intuition, I'm sure many of you know, since this is a digital humanities and data science group, many of you know word embeddings, but just briefly, the intuition is that not only do the frequency of words differ across works, so some social theory people may recognize the one on the left, that's the Communist Manifesto. The text on the right is Machiavelli's The Prince. So the word working is used much more in Marx's Communist Manifesto, but it's also used in different ways. And we know that because we can look at the context in which the word is used. So that's the intuition behind word embeddings. It's not just counting words, but it's representing words as vectors that takes into account all of the other words it co-occurs in an entire corpus. So we can see how a word is used. So for example, if you train a word embedding model on sociological literature, you give it something like the sociological imagination, one particular flavor, you would give it the surrounding words, the and imagination, and would try to predict that middle word sociological based on the kind of surrounding, the trained model. In other flavors, you give it the target word sociological and it tries to predict the surrounding words. So that's kind of a little bit of what's going on in the background of word embedding models. So one of the early models that was trained on Google Books, can be read as analogies. Women are to sewing as men are to carpentry. Women are to nurse as men are to surgeon. It panicked computer scientists. They said, oh my gosh, these are biased models. We need to de-bias these if we're going to use them in systems, which is true. If you're going to use them in resume recommendation systems, you have to de-bias them first, or you're going to encode bias into your systems. But social scientists, of course, who aren't building these systems said, hey, we can actually use these models, social scientists and humanists, to reveal intersecting systems of power. So this is a really great scholarly moment, and we can use these to look at that in different ways. So I think that we can push this one step further and say not only can we reveal biases that are encoded in language, but we can reveal, perhaps using the right data, the lived experience under intersecting systems of cultural power, so we can try to more formally measure this lived experience as it is embedded in these systems. So that's the intuition and the approach I'm kind of taking today here. So my broad strategy is to using the DocuSouth data, the two collections in the DocuSouth data, to map 4 combined social identities, Black and white men and women, and 4 social institutions, the polity, the economy, culture, and the domestic. So these 4 social institutions are very commonly theorized as being centers of social power, social and cultural power, political and economic power in the social world. So Marx, Weber, Durkheim, certainly in sociology, and then you bring in the Frankfurt School and the Habermas system and life world distinction and bring in the domestic here. So that's where these 4 social institutions come from. So mapping these social identities in these social institutions, and I produce 4 visualizations to show the specific and relational position of each identity embedded within the social institution as conveyed in the context of these narratives from the 19th century US South. And these narratives are largely pro-abolitionist. So when you interpret the results that I'm going to present, keep in mind that this is not a random sample of literature or documents produced in the 19th century US South, which would be much more anti-Black and pro-slavery. These are largely pro-abolitionist narratives from this period. So that's my overall strategy. So word embedding they turn words into vectors, and you can use vector addition to represent compound words in some sense. So I represented Black women as Negro plus woman, Black men as Negro plus man, and so on. And I did a bunch of sensitivity checks around this, so I can talk about how the resulting graphs change when you change the way that you represent these vectors. But what's important here for me as an intersectional scholar is that when you use vector addition, the resultant vector is different than both V and W in this case. So the vector addition changes the meaning of the 2 vectors, which produces, this is not my visualization, this is the a visualization from Google just trying to show high dimensional space, but every vector within the word embedding model will have a relational score, usually cosine similarity score, to every other vector in your space. So that's what I'm working from here. So every vector now gets a relational measure to every other vector. So for example, I'm just putting out the chat screen here. So the white woman vector has a cosine similarity score of 0.4 to the vector dainty. Black women is 0.26 and so on down to Black men. So this suggests that the Black men vector is much further away from the dainty vector compared to white women, and that there's some interesting intersectional results here already where Black women and white men are almost equally far away from it, which is not what you would expect here. All right, so I have my social categories, my social institutions, and I can't visualize millions and millions of words. So I take the 50 words that have the highest cosine similarity to my 4 social institutions, polity, economy, culture, and domestic, and that becomes my discursive space, which I'm going to visualize in the next few slides here. So these are just the 10 words from each of these 4 institutions that have the highest cosine similarity to these 4 social institutions, just giving you a sense of what these institutions kind of mean in this discourse. And then I can use principal component analysis just to visualize. So it's, really high dimensional space, these 200 words, we're gonna smush it down to 2-dimensional space. And this is kind of the discursive distribution in the data in this corpus. So if you just kind of interpret these axes, on the right side, we have domestic words and economy words. So that has to do with practical things, milking, chores, ironing, taking care of babies. On the left side, we get more aspirational words. So respectability, commonwealth, national, And then on the y-axis on the bottom, we have, this is individual. So ironing is an individual practical task, whereas the top is the collective. So this is kind of the two axes that separates the discourse in these data here, just to give context. So the next visualizations I show are going to be pulling out scatter plots, so 2x2 plots within this space, and then plotting the social identities as embedded into these 2x2 plots here. So that's what's going on here. So we have social identities plotted against culture and economy, culture and polity, domestic and the economy, and domestic and polity. So the intersectional principles I'm displaying here are, it's relational, everything is relational. It's also specific, so the relationship between identities changes depending on the institutional context that it's placed in. So the distances are different in each plot. I mean, it's embedded, right? We're mapping the identity embedded in the social space here, not abstracted from it. And what you see immediately is that the culture vector distinguishes the races, so on the left-hand side here. The domestic vector distinguishes by gender here, so kind of the main distinguishing vectors are culture for race and domestic for gender, but there's some interesting intersectional features as well here. So this is an example of how culture distinguishes between the races in this. So the culture vector is largely capturing what we think of as social status markers in the US South, things like refinement, gentility. So this was really important as social status markers in this century here. But on the top, you see a white woman talking about when the South was forced out of Washington. So this is during the Civil War, when the South was forced out of Washington. All the refinement, all the intellect, which once constituted the charm of Washington society, has departed with my brethren of the South. And in the bottom, you see a white man describing his wife. She's erudite without pedantry, charitable without parade, soft of speech but duly assertive, stickler for the social proprieties but void of prudery, ever genial but never frivolous. So these kind of status words are used very liberally by both white men and white women in this corpus. This is not the case with Black identities. So the writing of a Black man on the top there, he's very explicitly saying the only people during pre-Civil War era who had access to the gentility of white society were the house servants, those who had physical proximity to white society. So it's often the only method of obtaining any knowledge of the manners of what is called genteel society. So the bottom quote there from the Black man, this is how the traits they were more likely to use to describe themselves and be described by are merit, self-reliance, and a desire for teamwork, thrift, integrity, and high moral purpose. So very different types of traits that were used to describe different identities in here, and that's what's being picked up in these word embedding models. And this is a little bit related to the economy. So economic words were much more likely to be used alongside Black identities, and specifically in an interesting way, Black women. So a lot of times Black women were described according to their ability to make money. She had acquired by her industry and care more than $400. The bottom one is actually Sojourner Truth. I thought I would work and put some money in a savings bank. And then she reflects on the difficulties of her making money when a lot of other people are trying to make money as well. But this was not done for white women, not surprisingly. So white women were also celebrated for their industry, but in a very different way. It almost always had to do with their relationship to the domestic. So her industry, her management, and her executive ability in caring for and carrying on her household affairs are still wonderful memories. So industry, when related to Black women, was making money. White women, it had to do with the domestic. And then just one final, the four kind of, there's not too many surprising findings there. I think it's rich in a new lens, but I wanted to do one more look at slightly more less known social institutions. So this is that same kind of scatter plot, adding the authority vector and the emotion vector to the plot. And here we see an interesting intersectional output as well, with white men closest to the authority vector, Black women furthest away, and then Black men and Black women had kind of an uneasy, almost equal closeness to the authority vector. And that reflects history, right? Black men were often given a measure of power, specifically over Black women, in order to placate them, but also to uphold gender schema of the time, and white women, of course, had real power over Black men. So that was always a little uneasy power relationship between those two groups of people, which is being picked up in this graph here. The other thing to see in this graph here is the similarity or the closeness of white men to the emotion vector, which is a little counterintuitive given what we think of today as gender schema, where men are not supposed to be emotional. During this century and in this corpus, they actually were much closer to the emotion vector than I anticipated when I was creating these models here. And this is just an example of the way white men used emotions in this corpus, and this is really all over this corpus, specifically related to the Civil War. So General Rhodes was not only a comrade whom I greatly admired, but a friend whom I loved. So to ride away without even expressing to him my deep grief was sorely trying to my feelings, example. And on the bottom quote there, the death of a dear one in war does not bring with it the chastened sorrow of a peaceful death. It inflames and infuriates the passion for blood. It intensifies the thirst for another opportunity to see it flow. So these white men were not only experiencing the Civil War in a very emotional way, they were narrating their experiences of the Civil War in an interesting way. There's a question in the chat, is this a context-free model? I assume you mean context-free as in the grammar. So it's a word embedding model, meaning every word is embedded in a vector that's produced from all of the other words it co-occurs with, and then a data reduction technique on that, that happens through the word embedding process. So that's how that was created. So data reduction using on all of the other words that a single word co-occurred with, producing millions of vectors in this model that I've reduced down. So white men were allowed an emotion, and Black men and women really weren't. So the first quote, this top quote here is from a narrative actually written by a white woman posing as a Black woman, which is a little bit too appropriate for our current moment. So she passed herself off as an ex-slave, and she wrote this narrative, and she is explicitly articulating the fact that Black men and women aren't expected or aren't provided the ability to narrate emotions here. Would it not be better for me if I could repress all the lofty emotions and generous impulses of my soul and become a spiritless thing? So she's trying to emphasize that, yeah, in fact, Black women have emotions because they're not actually given that by white society. So just an example of the distance that Black identities were given to emotions here. So in sum, all of those quotes and word embedding models there, the kind of summary is culture distinguished the races, domestic words, domestic vectors distinguished by gender. The economy had an interesting intersectional dynamic. White men were closest to the authority vector, Black women furthest away, with white women and Black men an uneasy in between. And it's kind of flippant, but white men had emotions, or they were able to articulate emotions that was not allowed Black men and women identities. So to kind of summarize that, holistically, white identities were afforded a social status via culture and a humanity via emotions that were not allowed Black identities in this corpus, which established a kind of deep, but perhaps subtle discursive canyon between the races. And remember, this is largely anti-slavery, pro-abolitionist writing. So this is not the kind of pro-slavery writing that you would expect to see from the South. So even in this kind of pro-abolitionist literature, we're seeing this deep discursive difference between the ways that these identities were allowed to express themselves in some way. And I want to emphasize here that this is a starting point, not an end point. So by using word embedding models in this way, by graphing them in this way to show these embedded relationships and differences, this would be a great starting point for a social scientist or humanist to look further. So I was surprised, for example, that the polity didn't divide the races more. And that would be an interesting point to dig deeper into what was going on around political language at this time. I certainly was surprised by that white men were so close to the emotional vector. So that would be something to do a deep dive in. So the benefit of this approach and these methods is it can give you this kind of broad map of your corpus, of your the discursive space you're looking at, and then you can do deep dives wherever you want to do deep dives into without losing the kind of broader context here. So starting point, not an endpoint of analysis. So that's the kind of empirical example of using machine learning in an intersectional analysis here. So I just want to reflect now a little bit on the methods in general. And I'm seeing the question comes in. I'm going to just do my reflections, and then I will get to the questions, so I don't I'm getting lost between the chat, me losing internet, and the argument here. So I'll just finish up and I'll get to those questions that are coming in the chat. Thanks for them. So computational methods are a quantitative method with a qualitative epistemology. That's my claim. That's what I'm hoping to convince people here of today. And what we are seeing is a missed opportunity. So the way that these methods are typically used is trying to force them into the inferential statistics method, but also into this kind of finding these universal patterns. So the title here, and this is a paper I respect, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's indicative of the way that most people are approaching these methods. So the title here is the nearly universal link between the age of past knowledge and tomorrow's breakthroughs in science and technology, the hotspot. So the approach here is use all this data we have access to, compare across many different fields, cultures, societies, and find a universal law that applies across all of them. And we see this over and over again. So this is an early one, published in 2011. Again, looking at in all these different continents here, countries, we see the same. When it's bright outside, people are happy. They're happier during the day than they are at night. So this idea that we want to find these universal patterns that hold across all of these different contexts here is pretty pervasive. And these are all published in Nature and Science. So the loudest voices, in the sense that the ones are being published in these big name places, are the ones that are looking for these universal patterns abstracted out of context here. And from my world, in Northeastern scale-free networks, this idea that almost all networks follow a same temporal pattern, regardless of field, regardless of context, is the desired kind of outcome of these network science methods here. So I think what I'm hoping to convince some people of is that we can do this, that work is all very important, but we can also be doing it in a different way. We can leverage what I think is a really powerful alignment, a breakthrough alignment, if you will, between machine learning and intersectionality. And we can be doing that type of research in a new way with a new lens and a new perspective. And that will help us help advance both intersectionality and machine learning. We can gain much more out of machine learning as this new, newish, exciting paradigm if we also use it in this way, intersectional way. So what does this mean? How do we leverage this alignment? I mean, intersectionality is one approach. There's lots of other qualitative approaches, but we should be thinking about what we are studying and with what data. So a lot of the research done using these methods is on the Web of Science, patents, IMDb, Yelp, etc. This is basically reproducing what we have been doing for decades, which is we collect data on largely dominant populations, white men in some ways. IMDb is dominated by white men in this data. And we're not expanding the scientific record to additional populations that have historically been left out. So we can call in populations that have been left out. I don't want to surveil populations, but I think we can build a better scientific record if we think about representation in data. I would argue context is critical. I don't fully understand this push of finding universal patterns that occur everywhere. I'm much more interested in contextual patterns. When doesn't a pattern fit? When doesn't it hold? And what does that mean about the social world? I think we can learn a lot more about mechanisms in the social world if we look at context and when patterns don't fit. And we should make big data small. When we aggregate experiences, when we statistically aggregate over big data, it finds the dominant pattern, which again, depending on your data, is often white men or at least white people. And it silences these intersecting experiences through that statistical aggregation. And there's study after study that shows this. We don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to aggregate. We can look at the kind of smaller pockets of the population that can reveal a lot about what's going on in the social world. And I would argue we should approach it with a qualitative epistemology, not an inferential statistics epistemology. So we need to understand our data on a deep level and use qualitative lenses. And there's all sorts of work done by sociologists and others in the qualitative method space that can help us think about this approach. And one big thing there that I'll just mention very briefly is thinking about random samples. Almost all of these quote unquote big data studies are not on random samples. They're case studies, they're Twitter, they're Reddit. There are lots of ways of thinking about how we can build theory from case studies that come from qualitative methods research in the social sciences, certainly a lot in the humanities as well, if we're drawing in humanities approaches. And we need to be thinking about how you develop theory from case study methods, not how do we infer population dynamics from a sample of a population. That's simply not what we're doing anymore. So we need a different approach. This is not without challenges. We certainly need to develop more standards around model sensitivity. All of these algorithms, when applied, are really sensitive to the parameters you put in, the data you put in, which algorithm you use. There's hundreds of word embedding algorithms that we could use here, how you set up your vectors. So we need a way to assess when what you're finding is kind of a stable pattern and when it might just be an artifact of your parameters. And data accessibility and representation, just because data exists doesn't mean it exists for the populations you want to study, nor is it accessible. So I think the privatization of data is one of the biggest challenges facing us right now, and we need to be pushing back hard on the privatization of data. And certainly we need to be thinking about privacy, ethical, human rights, and social justice issues, which there's tons and tons of work on when we do this stuff. So I'll leave you with this claim that the future of machine learning perhaps is intersectional, because both machine learning and intersectionality assume relational data, embedded data, situational data, contextual, mutually constitutive, inductive. It's data-driven. It starts from a point of uncertainty rather than certainty. And I think that it produces a way to provide more interpretation to your data compared to the inferential statistics. And just to remind us all, I mean supervised machine learning and unsupervised machine learning for this inductive approach. So let's do it. Let's look for meaning making, not patterns, understanding, not laws, and looking at the contextual, not the universal here. And that is kind of my program that I propose for interpretive data science, in a way that we can get much more out of these methods than we can if we're doing the kind of universalist approach that many data scientists are doing, which is great research, but it's not the extent that we can be using these methods to do. I will stop there, and I see there's some questions in the chat, but I also will ask the Texas A&M people how you like to do discussion in these Zoom